Hello again, everybody. So one of the things I try to do with this channel is explain scientific topics when people ask. Mostly I talk about books and movies and other things, but as a physicist, sometimes I do like to answer questions. This week, I had a bunch of questions about this whole announcement that Iran might be 2 weeks away from nuclear weapons, and who cares? They're hard to make. We all saw the movie last year, and they're really difficult. Well, let's go over a few things, right? So why is this a concern? Why do we care? Or do we care? Do we not care? So let's take a look at it. So there's two kinds of nuclear reactors or nuclear bombs that are known, three types actually, that are known, but two main types we care about. I'm only going to talk about those two because the third kind is so complicated, it's just not worth even looking at just yet. There's uranium and plutonium, but there's a lot of confusion. People just love to throw that word around and say, "It's purified this, it's whatever that." Let's really look at it a little bit. So the uranium reaction chain comes in two varieties. You've got uranium 235, you got uranium 238. What the heck does that mean? Those are just different uranium isotopes. So it's uranium, but it's with a different nucleus inside that uranium. A little bit of extra neutrons in one case than the other, but it's anyway. So you got a little bit different isotope. One of those matters. One of those, actually, they both matter. One of those matters for reactions. Now, if you look at it from the natural abundance, let's say you just have a uranium mine and you're out digging it up, right? You say, hey, what do I need? I need some pile of uranium. I need to send it off to this reactor so they can generate electricity. So there's three types of uranium that are going to come out of the ground. There's 238, 235, and 234. The most abundant one you're going to find is 238. It's 99%, or it's actually higher than 99% of all uranium dug out of the ground. The one you care about for both reactors and weapons is 235. So the reactor grade stuff, you have to, once you dig it out of the ground, you have to purify it. We all saw that in Oppenheimer. They spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to purify this stuff. Well, inside that pile of uranium, you have to pull out the stuff that's actually useful for those reactions. So that's 235. Well, that's less than 1% of what you get there. So if you just go dig it out of the ground, less than 1% of what you need is even useful for reactors. So to get it to work in a reactor, you have to purify it. You have to strip out the 238s and the 234s and all the stuff you don't care about. Actually, 234 so rare you don't even care, but 235 and 238, you have to pull those two things apart. To get it to work in a reactor, you got to get to 3.5 or 4.5% of the 235. Now, weapons grade, you got to get it up well over 90%. So that's a whole different world, right? Purifying from 3.5 or 4.5 up to 90. And that's why you see countries struggling to build these centrifuges, and that's why we track how you're building centrifuges, and that's why tracking materials for those things matter. Well, the trouble is, it ain't that hard to build. It's hard, but it's not as hard as it was in the 1940s to separate those two, right? So it's a lot simpler than it once was. Now, this is still complicated to this day. This is not that simple because what you're trying to do is separate two things that have ever so slightly different weights, and they ain't much different, right? It's the very tiny little differences, and you're trying to pull them apart. So it's still, even today, complex to do this. Not as complex as it was in the 1940s, still not easy, right? So that still takes a lot of effort, it takes a great deal of money, it takes a great deal of time. It's not something, a cookie guy from James Bond goes back in the lab and, miraculously comes up with a new way to do it. That's tough to do. Plutonium is the other one. Plutonium is actually formed inside a nuclear reactor. So let's go back and look at this, right? So here's the reaction inside 235. Remember, that's the one that you want. You get uranium and a neutron. Neutron hits it. You get strontium. You get xenon, and a whole bunch of energy, right? So that just means energy. Well, if you still got 238 inside your reactor, which you will because you only purified it to 3.5 to 4.5%, right? So there's still a lot of uranium 238 inside your reactor. When you hit it with a neutron, sometimes you get uranium 239, a beta reaction. You go through this other beta reaction. Now you've got plutonium. Okay, keyword there, plutonium. So inside a nuclear reactor, you actually create plutonium. Now, who cares, right? So plutonium is actually formed inside that reactor. So we'll picture plutonium on the side there. And that's when it's just operating a typical, 1,000 megawatt nuclear power reaction, which is not unusual inside a reactor. You can actually, create quite a lot of this stuff. So the greatest source of that is actually friendly power reactors. It winds up in the nuclear waste all the time. Now, how do you build a bomb, right? So who cares, right? So plutonium by itself, interestingly or not, depending on how you look at it, this little pile of plutonium here, if you just left it sitting outside, and let's say it was purified enough, it's actually more dangerous as a toxin than it is as an explosive, because it gets hot like that and it tends to flake off and float around. And if you ingest like 1 gram of it, you're essentially going to die. There's no hope for you. And it's going to be painful. It is not a pretty way to go. So a weapons grade plutonium is predominantly 239. Typically about 93% of it is 239. So it's not really that hard to get, because let's go back here and look. 239 is right there. So there it is. It comes out of the nuclear reactor, and that's what you need to build the bomb, right? So what are the two types of bombs? Because we all saw Oppenheimer, and it didn't really explain it all that well. It just said we built one. So plutonium requires all these focused lenses, and they require a lot of engineering and a lot of timing, and these things have to be exactly right. And in 1940, that was really tough. Today, it's not as tough as it was, because technology's come a long way to get all that timing circuitry much better off. Uranium devices are a ton easier to build. So really, you just take a pile of a conventional explosive and 2 pieces of uranium that have been purified enough and smack them into each other hard enough, and it goes nuclear. So there's 2 things to remember here. One is uranium bombs, really hard to get the material, really easy to build the device. Plutonium bombs, really not, it's hard to build a device, but not as hard as it was in 1940. But because of this reaction chain that we learned about back here, it exists inside nuclear waste. Now, in 1940, there weren't a lot of nuclear reactors around, and that was a little more complex of a problem, but they had an easier time getting that plutonium because they didn't have to purify it. The only reason that we used a uranium bomb in Japan during World War II was because we actually didn't test it first. That device was the first test of it ever. We didn't test it first because we didn't have enough purified uranium to do that. So that purification process is shockingly hard, and we were just kind of like fingers crossed, hope it works. But you smack those two together, and it did work. But the point is, hard to get the material for uranium. Plutonium, it comes out of a nuclear reactor, and to get it out of the reactor, it's a chemical reaction. You give me 2 good grad students who know actinide chemistry, we could pull this stuff apart in a weekend and have it purified to the level you need for a bomb. It ain't hard to get the material if you've got the right nuclear waste. And that's why everybody watches nuclear reactors like there's no tomorrow, right? When you pull those things apart and you say, hey, look, I got to reload it, right? The uranium in there is all been used. I got to pull that stuff out and put new stuff in. That's when all those inspectors from all over the world fly in. That's what, countries like Iran don't necessarily want us in there. So this is actually a problem I've been looking at for a long time. So if anybody has questions, please email me. I usually will answer pretty quickly, send me direct message, whatever. I've been looking at it since like 2004. I actually even wrote a book about it. What happens if Iran gets a nuclear weapon? Fiction book. It's not nonfiction, but there's a ton of nonfiction books out there. Richard Rhodes has written quite a few of them. There's others out there if you really want to learn more. But the point is, 2 types of weapons we care about when it comes to countries like Iran: plutonium and uranium. Uranium, hard to get the material, easy to build a bomb. Plutonium, really easy to get the material if you've got a nuclear reactor, and Iran's got 5 or 6 of them. I have a list here. So they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So Iran's got 7 of them. And every once in a while, you have to unload those things and reload them with more uranium. And that's usually when inspectors get kicked out of the country. So will they have one? How many will they have? We could do the math on that if you want, but, it's certainly not to the level of U.S. Arsenal or somebody else's. The difficulty is these guys, I think, really want to use it. And with all the stuff going on in the Middle East right now, I'm pretty sure they would find an excuse to use it. So let's hope that doesn't happen. But with the news articles hitting this week of it's only 2 weeks away. Well, it's 2 weeks away because they just changed out all the fuel in their reactors, and we kind of know that what's going. It's how long it takes to do all that stuff. So that's how we figured that one out. Now, are they actually going to do it? Who knows? But the world is a dangerous place, so we'll see what happens. But that's sort of the secret world of nuclear weapons. There is one more type. It's a fusion bomb, incredibly complicated to build. And that one I could talk about at length if anybody wants, but it has nothing to do with the Iranian threat. They're not remotely close to that level. For them to have gotten to that level, they would have had to have been testing plutonium bombs by now, and they haven't really done that. So to get a fusion bomb to work, you actually have to put the fusion reaction inside a fission reaction. So you have to put a bomb inside a bomb inside a bomb. It's really weird. But those are the bombs that get massive, right? So uranium and plutonium bombs have sort of a limit on how big they can get. Fusion bombs, there's kind of no limit. We built some massive ones. The Russians built one that destroyed an island. It was like an atoll in the South Pacific. They just no longer exist. Those are the really, really big ones. The uranium and plutonium ones are smaller by comparison. They're still big because they're nuclear, but they're still smaller but than the fusion ones. Hope this answered the question. If any others around, let me know. And if you want to see what might happen if Iran gets them, I kind of wrote a book about that. So check it out. It's on Amazon. Everybody have a great day.